He never made promises, not once. No late-night declarations, no vows whispered in the dark, no dramatic lines about forever. In the beginning, I mistook that for detachment. I was used to men who pledged everything too soon, who said all the right things and meant very little of them. So, when he didn't offer promises, I waited, confused. I thought, why won't he reassure me? Doesn't he want to keep me? But he never said what he didn't intend to live, and that silence was unsettling at first. The first time I noticed it was subtle. I'd mentioned, half asleep, that I hated when people were late. Days later, he showed up 10 minutes early. He didn't mention why. He didn't make it into a point. He just remembered. I kept waiting for him to say something sweet about how he'd always show up for me. But he never did. Instead, he just kept doing it, showing up, staying consistent, without ever using words as leverage. No promises, just presence, and that was new to me. I tried to draw it out of him, those lines that sound good in a relationship. You'll always be here, right? I asked once. He looked at me with that steady gaze and simply said, I'm here now. It frustrated me. I wanted more. I wanted the illusion of certainty, even if it was false. But he refused to trade honesty for comfort. That answer, I'm here now, wasn't a lack of care. It was a refusal to make promises he couldn't guarantee. And later, I'd see that was more loving than any scripted reassurance. I was used to words as currency. Men who talk circles around their own inconsistency. Who made promises in moments of guilt or desperation. Who said, I'd never hurt you, only to disappear the next day. So when he remained quiet, when he offered no sweeping claims, I assumed something was missing. But what was missing wasn't love, it was performance. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything, he was just being himself, steady, intentional, and completely uninterested in selling a fantasy. His silence on promises used to make me doubt him. But slowly, I noticed something else. He never broke my trust. He didn't need to promise he'd listen. He always did. He didn't need to say he respected me. He showed it in every boundary he upheld. He never told me I was safe, but I never once felt like I had to beg for it. It was the strangest paradox. The man who said the least delivered the most. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I needed promises anymore. I just needed this. Him as he was. At first, I didn't trust it. The way he never offered guarantees. My mind kept waiting for the catch. Was he holding back? Was he planning an exit? Because I had learned to associate promises with commitment and silence with indifference. But then I realized most people promise out of fear. Fear of loss, fear of being misunderstood, fear of having to prove something. He didn't operate from fear. He moved from clarity, from a grounded place that didn't need declarations to validate what was already true. The deeper we got, the more I started noticing how rare his kind of integrity was. He didn't say he'd call, he just called. He didn't swear to be loyal, he simply was. There was no build-up, no just wait, you'll see. No timeline of emotional milestones. Instead, there was rhythm, repetition, presence. And it made me uncomfortable at first, because it lacked the drama I mistook for depth. But then it started feeling like something I didn't even know I was starving for, safety that didn't announce itself. There were so many moments where another man might have said something to ease the tension. Like when I cried unexpectedly, or when I pulled away hoping he'd chase. But he didn't fill those spaces with words. He sat through them. He stayed, not saying what he thought I wanted to hear, but doing what was right in that moment. And that taught me something subtle, but life-changing words can create illusions. But behavior, consistent, quiet behavior builds truth. He never promised he'd stay, he just stayed. Once, I told him, you never make promises. Doesn't that bother you? He tilted his head and replied, why would I promise something I should be proving every day? I didn't know how to respond, because he was right. A promise, after all, is only needed when our actions aren't enough. And with him, the action was always there. It made me realize how many empty vows I had accepted before, how many forevers had been spoken by people who didn't mean tomorrow. He didn't say forever. He lived like it. Eventually, I stopped needing the verbal proof. Not because I gave up, but because I began to see what was in front of me. A man who didn't need to be reminded to show up, who didn't falter when no one was watching, who didn't rely on sentiment to carry him through moments that required character. His love was quiet but exact, not perfect, but intentional. And for the first time, I felt something I couldn't name at first: peace. Not the kind born from beautiful words, but from dependable actions. He never said, "I'm a man of my word." He never had to. His life spoke for him. Everything aligned: his tone, his choices, his timing. And in that alignment, I started to understand something I had overlooked in past relationships: the difference between saying and being. I dated men who knew the right things to say. They could speak of dreams, devotion, and destiny with conviction. But when it came to action, they wavered. He, on the other hand, said little, but never wavered. He was the promise, even without the words. The contrast between him and my past became undeniable. I remembered moments where someone told me they'd always be there, only to disappear when I needed them most. Big words, no follow through. But him? He never said, "You can count on me." Yet when life unraveled, when I got sick, when my family fell apart, when I lost confidence in myself, he was there, calm, undramatic, unshaken. His presence said what his mouth never did: "I'm here, not for applause, just because it's the right thing to do." One time, I asked him why he never made grand romantic gestures, not out of complaint, but curiosity. He looked at me and said, "I think showing up every day matters more than surprising someone once." It landed deeper than he probably meant it to, because I realized how addicted I'd been to high moments, to highs in general. I craved promises because I craved emotional spikes. But what he gave me wasn't a high, it was a horizon. Steady, reliable, always there. And in time, that steadiness became enough, more than enough. His way of loving taught me that integrity isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't depend on theatrics. It happens in small moments when no one's watching, when no credit is given, when there's nothing to gain. Like when he fixed something in my apartment and never mentioned it. Or when he remembered my schedule better than I did. He didn't do these things for validation. He did them because they aligned with who he was. No need to promise. He simply became the evidence. With him, I stopped waiting for someday. There were no dreamy talks about a future he might not live up to. Instead, he made the present feel solid, safe, real. He wasn't planning to become a better man in 5 years. He was choosing to be a good man today. That daily decision meant more than all the pretty words I'd once mistaken for love. I began to realize that love isn't what someone says they'll do. It's what they do when they have every chance not to. And he always did what was right, even when it was hard, even when it was quiet. There's something deeply humbling about being with someone who doesn't rely on mood to dictate their actions. He never said, "I'll do it if I feel like it." He just did it on time, without drama, even when no one clapped. At first, I thought it was robotic, maybe even emotionally distant. But I came to see the discipline behind it. He didn't let his feelings interfere with his word. He didn't wait for motivation to kick in. He followed through because it was right, not because it was convenient. That kind of consistency was rare and confronting. I remember waking up late one morning, frazzled and behind on everything. I came out to find that he'd already done the small tasks I'd mentioned the night before in passing, things I forgot I even said. He never made it a moment. Didn't leave a note, didn't say, "Look what I did." He just handed me coffee and moved on with his day. That's when I realized his love wasn't in grand gestures, it was in remembering, in listening, in doing what most would call the little things, consistently and without reward. When I asked him once why he was always so steady, so predictable in the best way, he simply said, "Because if my values change with my mood, they're not values." That stopped me cold. I had always believed emotions justified actions. If I was upset, I could lash out. If I was anxious, I could retreat. But he wasn't like that. His mood never excused his behavior. His principles held even when tired, even when provoked. It made me question how much of my behavior had been based on feelings rather than actual standards. I used to think consistency meant boredom, that the absence of chaos was the absence of passion. But being with him proved me wrong. There was passion in his self-control, power in his quiet routines. He didn't need adrenaline to stay committed. He didn't need emotional highs to feel close. And over time, I realized that what I once labeled as too calm was actually a man who had mastered himself. And through that mastery, he gave me something no one had before, stability that didn't shake just because I did. He once told me, "I don't need to promise what I can prove." And he meant it every day without fail. He proved who he was, not through speeches or apologies, but through repetition. through presence, through character, and what's more, he expected nothing in return. That kind of discipline, loving without applause, showing up without being asked, choosing the right thing even when no one's keeping score, it changed the way I saw everything, especially myself, because next to his steadiness, I saw my storms more clearly. There were moments when my old patterns crept in, nights when I needed to hear something comforting, mornings when I wished he'd say something soft before leaving. And when he didn't, the fear would flare up. See, does he even care? But then, like clockwork, he'd show up again with quiet reliability. No shift in tone, no emotional apology, just presence. I slowly realized my fear wasn't rooted in what he did or didn't do, but in what I'd been taught to expect love should look like. His love didn't reassure through words, it reassured through evidence. I used to search his face for signs of something deeper, some crack in his armor that would finally give me the romantic performance I thought I needed. But over time, I stopped searching. Not because I gave up, but because I started trusting the way he operated. He didn't try to fix my insecurity with affection. He addressed it by staying consistent, by doing the right thing again and again until my nervous system had no choice but to settle. Not because he said I was safe, but because I felt it. He never once said, "You can rely on me," but I did. He never promised he'd always be there, but he was. And one day it hit me, the reason I was always waiting for words was because I had relied on them for stability. I was trained to believe in promises because I'd never actually experienced long-term consistency. With him, I wasn't being comforted by fantasy, I was being calibrated to reality. And that shift, while subtle, was life-altering. I didn't need to be told he was solid, I lived it daily. There was a time when I broke down unexpectedly, overwhelmed and spiraling. I didn't expect him to know what to do. I didn't ask him for anything. But he moved without hesitation, grabbed water, dimmed the lights, sat next to me without trying to solve it. No words, just presence. I remember thinking he didn't say it would be okay. But I knew it would be. Because he didn't run. He didn't fill the space with empty comfort. He held the weight of the moment with me. And that was worth more than any vow. That was the moment I stopped needing grand statements. His love didn't rely on performance. It relied on practice. It was built quietly through the discipline of showing up. I started noticing how much he noticed, how his responses were always tailored, precise, intentional. And I thought, how did I almost miss this? How did I almost walk away from something so real, just because it didn't come wrapped in pretty words? He never promised to catch me. But every time I fell, he was already there. That's when I understood this was the promise. All along, he never asked me to match him, never demanded I become more disciplined, more grounded, more like him. He didn't try to shape me. He simply lived by example. And something about that quiet leadership made me want to rise, not for him, but because I saw who I could be beside him. A version of myself that wasn't built on emotional highs or romantic illusions, but on steadiness, presence, clarity. He never said you should grow. He just grew in front of me, and suddenly I wanted to grow too. The beautiful irony was this: the man who made no promises gave me the most space to become who I truly was. He didn't tether me with declarations or entangle me with guilt. He didn't manipulate with future plans or use someday as a leash. He gave me room to think, to feel, to stumble, to reflect. And he remained, not waiting to be worshipped, not hoping I'd notice, just there. His love wasn't a performance, it was a quiet force field of character. And within that, I began to understand trust. Before him, I thought love had to be earned through drama, that if it wasn't tested, it wasn't strong. But he flipped that narrative. He didn't test me. He didn't make me prove anything. He gave without negotiation, gave his time, his focus, his respect, without ever saying, "Because I love you." And because of that, I learned the difference between proving and offering. His love didn't hold me accountable through pressure. It held me accountable through presence. That was far more transformative than any emotional plea. One evening, we sat in silence on the porch. No deep talk, no long eye contact, no romantic gesture. Just the sound of wind and him beside me, breathing quietly. I realized in that moment that I didn't need to be swept off my feet. I just needed a place to land. And he was that place, not flashy, not loud, but deeply, unmistakably solid. For the first time in my life, love didn't feel like floating. It felt like grounding. And it wasn't because he promised to catch me, it was because he already had. His kind of love redefined everything for me. It didn't thrill me in the way I once thought love should. It didn't overwhelm me or leave me dizzy. It made me calm, focused, awake. It made me want to become the kind of person who didn't need promises to feel secure, because I could finally see what consistency looked like. And once you've experienced that, anything less feels like noise. He never asked me to become more, but because of how he lived, I did. Not out of fear, but out of love for him and for myself. There was a shift I didn't see coming, a moment where I caught myself no longer waiting for texts that sounded poetic, for verbal reassurances that once felt like oxygen. His silence used to feel like a test. Now it felt like a canvas, and I had filled it with my own clarity. I didn't need him to say, "I'm not leaving," because he never left. I didn't need him to promise I'll always show up, because he always had, without announcement, without reminders. Just quiet, lived truth one day at a time. It hit me one morning when I realized I wasn't anxious, that I wasn't rereading messages or dissecting conversations, hoping to find the sentence that proved he cared. I was just calm, and it wasn't because he had changed. It was because I had stopped looking for love in words and started recognizing it in the way he moved, in the way he made space for me to think, in how he noticed my needs before I named them. The man who spoke the least had given me the most peace. That peace wasn't passive. It was earned, built through 1,000 small choices he made that no one else would have seen. Choosing kindness when I was sharp, choosing stillness when I was frantic, choosing presence when it would have been easier to check out. He didn't use silence as distance. He used it as discipline. And because of that, I stopped associating quiet with absence. I started associating it with strength. I didn't need words anymore. I needed exactly what he gave: integrity in motion. I thought love needed to be loud, visible, echoed constantly to be believed. But this man, this quiet, constant, self-contained man, showed me that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just reliable. Sometimes it's not a sentence, but a gesture. Not a plan, but a pattern. He never said he'd be the one I could count on. He just lived like it. And because of that, I no longer waited for him to say the right thing. I was too busy witnessing it in everything he did. By then, I understood promises are easy. They take seconds to form and seconds to break. But character, that takes time. That reveals itself in silence, in routine, in the absence of applause. And his character, so rooted, so unshaken, became the thing I leaned on more than any promise ever could. He never asked me to trust him, but I did. Not because he said the right words, but because he gave me no reason to doubt them, even when they were never spoken. I used to think loyalty was something declared, a bold statement, a social post, a ring, a vow. But he never declared it. He just lived it. Loyalty in his world wasn't performance, it was principle. It wasn't about promising not to leave. It was about showing up, especially when no one expected it, especially when it was hard. He didn't stay because he had said he would. He stayed because it aligned with who he was. And that, to me, became the truest form of commitment. He never labeled what we were before he was ready, never rushed the next step to calm my uncertainty. But even without titles, I never felt unclear. He didn't waver. He didn't shift when I pushed or withdraw when I needed space. He didn't need words to declare belonging. He showed it through consistency, through how he remembered what mattered to me, through the way his world always had space for mine. I realized then loyalty isn't about how loudly someone claims you. It's about how deeply they respect your place beside them. There were weekends we barely spoke about us. No relationship check-ins, no deep talks. But every moment was built on something that felt solid. No passive-aggressive games. No emotional threats. Just two people being, choosing, staying. And I'd never known that kind of quiet security. I had confused attention with loyalty before. Now I understood real loyalty doesn't need reassurance. It proves itself in rhythm, in reliability, in the days that don't get posted about, in the hours when no one's watching. He once told me, "I don't say forever. I just make sure today counts." At the time, I thought it was avoidance. But now I see it was clarity. He didn't believe in empty forecasts. He believed in presence. He wasn't offering forever in words. He was offering it one moment at a time by never giving me a reason to question if today was solid. And strangely, that meant more than any promise of the future ever could. Because it wasn't fantasy, it was real. I was living it. In a world where people swear loyalty with breathless words and abandon it with casual silence, he was the opposite. He didn't say he'd never leave, but he stayed when it mattered. He didn't promise to protect me, but I never once felt unsafe beside him. His loyalty wasn't emotional currency, it was who he was. And as someone who once begged for certainty, I found something better than assurance. I found alignment. His values and his actions walked in step, and for the first time, so did mine. Others didn't see it. To them, he was too quiet, too measured, maybe even cold. Friends would ask, but does he ever say how he feels? And I used to flinch at that question, because no, he didn't say it the way they expected. He didn't declare love over dinner or flood me with daily affirmations. But I'd stopped needing that, because by then I had learned to read the language of his consistency, of his tone, his timing, his reliability. They couldn't see it, but I lived in it, and it was real. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to be understood by everyone. He never tried to defend his quiet nature or prove his intentions. He let people think what they wanted and stayed true to what he knew. That groundedness used to make me feel unsure, but the longer I stood beside it, the more I admired it. He wasn't shaped by perception. He wasn't swayed by praise. His identity wasn't built on being seen a certain way. It was built on integrity. And once I saw that clearly, I stopped needing anyone else to validate him. I used to think loud meant strong, passionate, convincing. But he taught me that real strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just refuses to lie, refuses to perform, refuses to say things it doesn't mean just to buy temporary peace. And that quiet refusal, that inner boundary, felt more loyal, more devoted, more real than any flowery line ever had. He didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. He showed me what I didn't know I needed to feel stability without spectacle. We live in a culture of noise, where validation comes in big moments and broadcasted affections. But his love existed off the stage, in the small things, in the way he never forgot what mattered to me, in how he always followed through, even when I didn't ask twice, in how he stayed present, even when I was messy or unsure. It was subtle, almost invisible to those outside, but it was there, constant, unshakable, the kind of love that doesn't beg for applause because it never needed an audience. By the time I tried to explain him to others, I stopped using words like romantic or passionate. I started using words like steady, principled, rare, because I realized his value wasn't in how well he performed affection. It was in how deeply he honored it. He never said, "You're the one," but he treated me like I mattered. And not just when things were easy. He did the hard things too, the boring, the inconvenient, the quiet. And that, I've learned, is where real love lives. Not in volume, but in proof. Before him, I thought love had to shake me, had to consume me, rattle me, leave me breathless. And in many ways, I had mistaken instability for intensity. But his love didn't shake me, it steadied me. It didn't sweep me off my feet, it handed me the ground under them. Slowly, gently, with no promises of forever, just the quiet reliability of today, and today again, and again. Until the rhythm of his presence became louder than any spoken vow I'd ever heard. He never interrupted me with "I love yous," but he never forgot the things I cared about. He didn't write long texts when I was sad, but he remembered the exact way I liked my tea when I didn't speak. He didn't tell me he'd support me, but I always found him quietly backing my decisions, never trying to control them. The more I paid attention, the more I realized his love wasn't the kind that needed to be declared. It just needed to be noticed. And once I noticed it, it changed everything. I started to soften in his presence, not because he demanded it, but because I finally felt safe. Not the safety of promises whispered during emotional highs, but the kind that shows up when nothing needs to be said. When someone keeps doing the right thing without being watched. When a man doesn't try to dazzle you, but shows you, over time, that he's already made the decision to show up. No campaign, no theatrics, just character, lived daily. That was his way. And eventually, it became mine too. People often asked what made him different. I used to struggle to answer. But now I say this, he did what most people only talk about. He lived his values, not sometimes, not when it was easy. Every day, he didn't need the language of love. He had the language of follow through, of remembering, of presence. And in a world where words are thrown around so casually that made him exceptional, he made me realize that maybe love isn't something we say at all. Maybe it's something we do without asking for recognition. And that's when I understood he was never trying to impress me. He was simply being himself, a man of quiet direction, a man whose loyalty wasn't loud but built into his decisions. And as someone who once needed the noise to feel loved, I found myself craving the silence, because in that silence I found certainty. In his quiet, I found answers. In his lack of promises, I found presence. And presence, I've learned, is the rarest promise of all, because it doesn't ask you to believe. It shows up and lets you know. Looking back, I realize he gave me something more valuable than certainty. He gave me reality. He never painted dreams or made grand predictions, but he was always there, grounded, deliberate, offering what was true in the moment. He didn't use the future as a crutch to soothe my doubts. Instead, he let the present speak for itself. He trusted that showing up consistently was more powerful than any poetic line. And he was right, because I can still remember what he did. The words, I don't miss them. He never said, I'll never hurt you. But he was careful with me, intentional. Even when we disagreed, he never let frustration bleed into disrespect. He never raised his voice just to win, never used silence to punish. He didn't offer safety through promises. He created it through behavior. And that distinction, I learned, is everything. Words can feel good in the moment, but they're fragile. His kind of love. It was built to last, not because he said so, but because it proved itself again and again, without announcement. There were times I thought about leaving, not because he did anything wrong, but because my old self craved more noise, more reassurance, more drama. I was conditioned to chase intensity, not stability. But every time I stood on the edge of doubt, he didn't pull me back with speeches. He didn't beg. He simply remained unchanged. And his unshakable presence made me ask myself, why do I need to be pulled back at all? That's when I knew I was evolving. Not just with him, but because of him. He never once told me how I should live, never pushed me to be more like him. But the longer I stood beside his quiet integrity, the more my chaos softened, my reactions slowed, my emotional need for reassurance dissolved. I stopped needing to hear things that were already being shown. He never asked me to change, but he made me want to. Because if love could be that steady, that honest, that effortless in its discipline, then I wanted to match it, not for him. For me. In the end, I understood that love is not proven in the big, loud moments, it's in the patterns, the quiet habits, the consistency no one claps for. He may never have said, you can count on me, but I did. He never said, I'll always do right by you, but he did, over and over. No fanfare, no spotlight. Just quiet proof that a man doesn't need to promise the right thing when he's already doing it. And honestly, that's the kind of love that rewrites you. Gently, completely, without needing a single word. If you asked me now whether I ever wished he had said more, I'd say no, not anymore, because words fade. They echo for a moment, then dissolve. But what he gave me, the proof of who he was day after day, has never left me. He didn't write poetry or make promises in the dark. But he made sure the lock on my door was fixed. He remembered how I took my coffee. He showed up without needing to be asked. That kind of love doesn't need vows. It's already sacred because it's real. Sometimes I wonder how many people pass up a love like his. How many look for fireworks and overlook the fire that just quietly stays lit. The kind that warms you, not burns you. That doesn't promise forever, but honors today. He never needed me to believe in him. He just lived in a way that made belief effortless. And I think that's the rarest thing of all, not needing to be convinced. The truth is already in front of you. Not loud at all, but undeniable. He changed me, not with speeches, not with romance, but with steadiness. With the way he never sold me a future he couldn't see, but kept showing up in the present fully. I once craved certainty in words. Now I crave integrity in action. I used to fall for men who promised more than they gave. Now I revere the man who gave more than he ever promised. That shift didn't just change the way I loved. It changed who I became. Because standing next to his quiet truth, I found my own. It's strange, isn't it? How someone who said so little left such a lasting echo. He didn't promise to love me forever, but the way he treated me made me feel like I'd always been worth loving. He didn't ask me to stay, but he gave me every reason not to leave. And he didn't tell me what love meant. He showed me. And in that showing, I learned that the right thing doesn't always need to be spoken. It simply needs to be done. Repeatedly. With grace. So no, he never made a promise. Not one. But he never broke my trust. He never gave me false hope. He never used words as a cushion for bad behavior. And because of that, I now understand what real love looks like. It's not loud. It's not poetic. It doesn't live in someday. It lives in today, in presence. He didn't say he was the right man. He acted like one every day. And that, in the end, was the most honest kind of vow I've ever received.